says recording, you are not being recorded. Only those of us who are unmuted and speaking with the little yellow box around us will show up in that recording. So you don't need to worry about that fact. And you can use the chat throughout the evening to post any questions or comments that you might have. Davith and I will be using the chat through the evening to post links to all of the books that are being talked about. So if you miss a title or an author, look in the chat, it will be there. As well as a link to the book on our website. And then also if you need to look back at a later date, there is a blog post on the Northshire Notes from the Shire blog that has all of the titles listed. So those are there. You can look them up at any point and order them on our website. And we will be adding any extras that we wind up talking about later on in the evening that we weren't planning on to that probably tomorrow morning at some point. Give us a couple hours to be up and functional, and that will happen. I think those are all of my notes, and then Davith is going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker.
Well, yes, and thanks so much. And it is a real pleasure to introduce Kathy Taylor. She's one of our great booksellers at Northshire's Manchester location. And some of you who have attended Booktopias in the past will recognize her as a seasoned book recommender. So Kathy, take it away and tell us about your books.
Okay, hi everyone, nice to be here. The first book I'm going to be talking about today is called The Governesses by French author Anne Serre. I hope I pronounced that okay. So as you can tell, it's a very thin book, but it packs a really big punch. And I read this probably in a few hours one foggy evening, and it was the perfect book for something like that. It's kind of dark and moody, but like a fairy tale. So it's great for evening winter reading. So the loose plot focuses on three women who are the governesses in the French countryside. They work for a couple and tend to their boys. You don't know exactly how many boys there are. There sometimes seem to be quite a few boys, sometimes just 3 or 4 boys. So it's sort of hypnotic in that way and a little bit unsettling. But the three women have this really magnetic energy. They sort of romp around and are mischievous and love to plan parties. From time to time, they also have these very large appetites and devour men. So I'll let you take that for what it is, but there are some sexual, very strong sexual undertones to this, but it's very, very good. They are the life force of the house, and it's really about a fable about womanhood and desire, birth and death and childhood and adulthood, but it's so pleasurable to read. And I'd recommend it. It's really great. So that was my first one. And then the next book I'm going to be talking about is nonfiction. It's called The Undying, and it's by Anne Boyer, who's also a poet. This won the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction this past year. And it details the author's experience with breast cancer. So she was diagnosed with an aggressive form of breast cancer when she was in her early 40s. And it's her reckoning with breast cancer's part of cultural history, its impact on her own life, and also sort of an analysis of the structure, the capitalist structure that exploits illness in our society. So her journey considers other women writers who have dealt with this topic, like Susan Sontag, Audre Lorde, Kathy Acker. There are so many, the list goes on, and how really not a whole lot has changed in that history. We pour a lot of money into campaigns and organizations that make a lot of money off of illness and for marketing and things like that. So she does have a lot of anger that she leans into, but it's such a fascinating read. I think most people have had a loved one who's been affected by cancer or who's died from cancer. And so it's really just a great deep dive into her personal experience. And she's so sensitive in her writing and so perceptive that it really opens up your mind and makes you more aware of your body in a way that I would really recommend it. It's a heavy topic, but I think anyone would really love this book. So that was my second one. I'm going to move on to Severance by Ling Ma, which is fiction. It is, takes place, it's sort of apocalyptic. So I would describe it as a crossover between The Walking Dead and The Office. So it's like an apocalyptic tale that takes place in an office setting. And it's really a funny, sharp, smart read. The main character is a young Chinese American woman who's living in New York City and working a deadening job at a company that publishes Bibles, and you'll learn a lot about the printing process overseas if you read this book. So she's working there when this virus emerges that slowly spreads and then eventually consumes the whole world. Those affected by the virus lose most of their mental functions and are just reduced to performing the most mundane rote actions that comprise their day, like folding clothes at a retail job or setting the table for dinner. Some people just drive taxis until they run out of gas. So it just sort of strips you down to your most basic labor functions. And it's really a funny book. The plot is split between two times: the past when the virus emerged and the present when the woman joins a camp of refugees and who have an increasingly cultish leader, because there's always a cultish leader in apocalypse stories. And she's also hiding the fact that she's pregnant. So it's really a book about so many different big ideas, like the immigrant experience in America, how capitalism reduces us to our most basic functions and how we live in such a system, and how we carve out a space to thrive and grow. But it's really a surprising book. Even if you don't like apocalyptic tales, I'd really recommend it because of those bigger themes. It surprised me when I read it. I didn't know if I was gonna like it or not, but I ended up loving it. So I hope you all try that out. And then the next fiction book I'm going to talk about is a book that's very special to me. I love this book very much. It's called They Came Like Swallows by William Maxwell, who was a longtime fiction editor at The New Yorker. And this is another thin little book, but it takes place during the time of Spanish influenza in a small town in Illinois. It focuses on one family, father, mother, and two sons, one older son named Robert and a younger son named Bunny. The mother and father go on a train trip, and return. The mother returns very ill, and she eventually dies from the Spanish flu. So it's about how the family deals with that death, which is she was the force holding them all together. And so the three men have to figure out how to live without her. It's a really beautiful book. His writing is really perfect, I'd say. So I'd really recommend picking it up if you want a nice little story here. So that concludes those. And then I'm throwing in a cookbook at the very end that I want to make a plug for, called The Flavor Equation by Nick Sharma. Nick Sharma wrote for Serious Eats for a long time, and he started a blog called The Brown Table, But this cookbook is really, besides being really beautiful, it's interesting because it deals with the chemistry of flavor. So he breaks down his book into a couple different sections here. The first details his theory of the flavor equation, which combines emotion, sight, sound, mouth feel, aroma, and taste. And then he goes into the chemistry of flavor. It has all sorts of fun charts there that show you how recipes are developed, and the recipes themselves are just stunning. I mean, the photography, I don't know if you can really see that, but it's gorgeous. So these are really creative, interesting recipes. You're gonna learn something in the book too. He's a really engaging writer. It would make a really nice present for yourself or someone else. So that's my plug for that. It was great to talk to you guys. Those are all my books. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Kathy. That was fantastic. And audience, Kathy is going to need to peel off and leave us, and she's going to tag in Joe from the Manchester Health System to join us in the office where she is currently. So it's nothing personal, but she does need to leave and say an actual goodbye. So thank you so much.
Hi guys. Thank you.
And while we're waiting on Joe, my wonderful friend and co-host Davith, who is the event manager for Northshire Manchester, is going to share his list of books.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Kathy. I've got 3 books to recommend, and I'll start with my usual weird one first. This is called, it's a beautiful, beautiful book by Elliot Weinberger called Angels and Saints. And he's a famous essayist. Gary Snyder said that he was the best living essayist. And the book, as I said, it's really bound beautifully. It's from New Directions, and it's got all of these very strange medieval manuscript poems. You can't really see, you see all the angels there, but these are each sort of concrete poems that look almost like an acrostic or a crossword puzzle. And they're all to be read in strange ways that show your devotion and mark certain things. And so it's really a beautifully done book from New Directions and Christine Bergen. But these essays themselves that they're about, not, I would say, for the most devout person, but he's got this great taste and eye for irony. He's seriously scholarship, looking through and carefully reading sort of every reference to angels in the Bible, and then all of the sort of Aquinas and everybody else that comes along, and sort of categorizes all of them and sort of walks through these. And then the section about saints, which is the majority of the book, is really very funny. Don't come here for St. Francis or St. Teresa of Avila or the more familiar saints. Rather, for instance, he's got a section called Hyacinths, in which is all these different saints named Hyacinth. A martyr, his existence is only probable. That's Hyacinth of Porto Romano. Goes on to dead Hyacinth in Egypt. He lived with the hermits of the desert, then went to Rome, where he was beheaded. Hyacinth of Paphlagonia. He cut down a tree sacred to the pagans and was tortured to death. And it moves through it like this. It's just sort of a series of things. And a lot of them are really wild and crazy. A lot of them are spurious. There's one saint, for instance, who would strike down the pets or the little animals that would nibble the plants at the monastery. All kinds of things like that. So it's really a funny book. I just tore through it. And it's also, I think, the most beautiful book I've seen all year, at least most beautifully bound, as I said, with a great spine and these very strange poems. The poems are not those maybe to be read. They're not particularly enjoyable. It said there's a great line in an essay at the end of this describing them. See if I can find it. I don't think I can, but the poet took more pleasure in writing them than the reader does, but they're in Latin anyway. So, but they're just enjoy these strange concrete poems. The next book I'm going to recommend is another gorgeous book. It's called The Look of the Book, and this is co-written by Peter Mendelsohn, who is, I think, sort of our most talented living jacket designer for books, for novels. If you've seen, if a jacket cover has really stood out to you, chances are it's probably one that he's done within the last 15 years or so. And so he takes this book with another colleague, and sort of it's this investigation into what the jackets of books do. And I don't know, this is it. For instance, he says they will flirt. And there's a little kiss there on this copy of Goodbye Columbus. They'll shimmy. It's Catch-22, the famous one. They'll wink. It's a picture of the Beyond the Pleasure Principle. This is a little book inside the book. Stare, shout. There's a fraud cover of David Rakoff's book. All kinds of things. Jaws. They'll titillate. It's an amazing discussion of what jackets do, and it's a beautiful coffee table book. It's cover of Psycho, picture of cover for Lolita, and it looks at different book, like lots of different covers of Moby Dick, comparing these things, and it's also the text in it is just really brilliant. The way it walks through these, and you've got this great craftsman, this great artist, talking about sort of what covers do and how it's this sort of new art form and the challenges of it. It's got to be really big. It can also be the size of a postage stamp. You can see on a website that sells books like ours. It's a beautiful book. I highly recommend it. And then the last book I want to talk about, I'm not finished yet. It is Ben Wilson's Metropolis, A History of the City, Humankind's Greatest Invention. And this is just a fantastic book of nonfiction. I'm really enjoying it. It starts at Uruk, the first city, where we get the word city, the one that Gilgamesh was at. And it talks about Enkidu and those characters from that. And then it just marches through time up to Athens and to Rome, which is where I'm reading now, all the way up to Lagos in Africa, as a modern city at the end. But it's a really fascinating book, and it's not dry in any sense like history is. We're jumping back and forth through time, even within, say, the section where it's talking about Rome, where there's several passages of talking about sort of the pleasures of the beach or of swimming based on sort of, the baths in Rome sort of bring us to this. And so he's talking about kids in the 1930s New York swimming in the horribly polluted East River with pictures of that. It's a really, I just gotta say, it's a really great book, and I'm really enjoying it. And those are my titles, and it is my pleasure to turn things over to Joe, floor manager in Manchester, and Joe Michel. Joe, what are you recommending for us?
Oh, a lot of things, David. You know me, always got one thing or another in front of me. I just wanted to first give a shout out to our amazing holiday staff picks. The staff worked really hard on this. It's double-sided this year. It's got the children's picks on the back and the adult picks on the front, or vice versa, depending on which floor you find it on. So I'm going to be talking about a few of my picks from that. And the first one that I wanted to show you is actually from the children's department. It is Our World. It's a first book of geography. It's a board book, nice and solid. And the cool thing about this, beyond the fact that it's beautifully drawn, beautifully illustrated, and has a lot of information itself right in there at the bottom. Good introduction to the different landscapes that the world has and the different seasons that it goes through. The coolest part about this is that it actually has a magnet right in the front and back cover, and it stands up like so. So it's a bit of an art piece as well. It's kind of a cool gift for a kid that might be a future Globetrotter, and educational as well. So the next book floored me. It is The Undocumented Americans, Carla Cornejo Villavicencio. It was a National Book Award finalist, and deservedly so. The thing that grabbed me the most about this was the voice itself. She has a wonderful voice, and it's full of anger and justifiable anger. She is a Harvard-educated, undocumented American. She talks to undocumented Latino workers in major cities. She talks to people that went through the water crisis in Flint. She talks to people who worked the cleanup crews after 9/11, all of whom were undocumented, and the health scares that they went through, the lack of support, And you can feel her anger in every word of this book. It is strong, it's powerful. I highly recommend this book. Last time I talked to you all, I talked about Lot by Brian Washington, which I loved. He wrote a book recently, his first novel, Memorial. It's just as good as Lot, if not better. It's strong. It feels like talking to an old friend. And the book is split up into two parts. One is narrated by one of the main characters, another by the second. And they're two men that are in a relationship, a Black man from Houston, the suburbs around Houston, and a Japanese American man right from the inner city. It's told partly in Houston and partly in Japan. And they're going through some trouble in the relationship. And that trouble leads them to a very odd encounter with different family members of theirs. And I won't say anything more because I don't want to spoil it. I flew through this book. It's sort of like a calm, gentle read, but it has a lot of grit and depth to it as well. If you read Lot and liked it, you're gonna love this book. I also talked last time about Crossings, which was on my to-read list by Alex Landdragon. I have to say, I just wanted to follow up. I loved this book. I read it twice because it sort of encourages you to. The first way that I read it was, it gives you this choice right at the beginning. Basically, it's about a manuscript that the person that is sort of calling himself Alex Landdragon finds, and he reads this manuscript and realizes that it can be read in one of two different ways. One is straight through, and another is basically following a chapter sequence that jumps around in the book. So it's got 3 different manuscripts in it, and you choose how you want to read it right at the beginning. I chose the alternate way first, and then I went back and read it straight through, and you discover different things about it each time you read it. It definitely encourages multiple readings. I don't want to say too much about it. It's sort of this multi-generational love story. It's got this darkness to it, and has a lot to do with a very small island in the South Pacific and the city of Paris. And those settings come alive just as much as the characters do. Heavily recommended for sure. I've been in love with Tana French ever since I read In the Woods. And her new one is a standalone. It's much different than her others. It's her attempt at a sort of Irish Western mystery. It's slower paced than her others. The core of the mystery doesn't even reveal itself until you're at least 100 pages in, but you really appreciate getting to know her characters. You enjoy being with them and exploring the landscape, slowly describing the mountainside and the fields and the plains of her small town and its surroundings. I really like the way that she writes characters, and the interesting thing about this one is that it's not a detective at the center of this mystery. It's a reluctant ex-cop, expatriate who came over to Ireland to escape his former police world. And instead of relaxing and working on his home, he gets sucked into this mystery very, very reluctantly. But it builds up to a great climax. I really appreciated how she built up the relationship between the 2 main characters in this book. If there are any podcast lovers out there in the world, you are in good company, and this is your season. There are 2 what I would call companion books. 2 of the most popular podcasts out there now have books that basically are almost theses for what they do. The first one I'll talk about is the Stuff You Should Know book by Josh Clark and Chuck Bryant. And if you've ever listened to the podcast, you know that their personalities shine through. This book is funny. It is enlightening, just like their podcast is. They basically focus on some of the odder subjects that they've probably talked about in their podcasts before. They actually even have little symbols next to every time that they mention a word or a subject that they've written a podcast about. So you can see that in there every time that they run across that. There are chapters on roadies, on the Scum Manifesto, on kamikazes, on donuts. Did you know that donuts actually used to have nuts in the middle, because that was the hardest part of the donut to cook. Interesting tidbit. There's a chapter on the pet rock. There's a chapter on the Jersey Devil. And there's even one on the phrase keeping up with the Joneses. It's enlightening, it's funny. I highly recommend this one. Get rid of that phone call. The 99% Invisible City is a book that Roman Mars and his partner, Kurt Kolstad, wrote about basically the inner workings of the city. If you've ever listened to podcasts, you know that he does this deep dive, beautifully written and constructed stories about the hidden design behind everyday objects. And in this book, he focuses on objects that make a city tick. So there's segments on guerrilla gardening, there's segments on hostile architecture, there are segments on the only traffic light that is actually inverted in America. It's really great, it's got illustrations, actually they both do. And if you're a fan of the podcast, these are definitely for you. And I wanted to finally wrap this up with my favorite cookbook of the season, Pieometry. It is easily the most beautiful cookbook that I have come across in a long time. And I will show you some of that. Her pies are gorgeous. They are art pieces in and of themselves. She teaches you how to do it with ease. They are complicated pies, but you feel like you have a grasp after you've tried a few of them. Just look at some of those weaving techniques. She actually goes step by step and teaches you how to do some of these weaving techniques, and her designs are artful. She actually has a section on different types of dough and how you can make a flavorful dough instead of just your normal pastry. I'm a big pie maker. I love that book, and I hope that you check it out. Back to you, David. Thanks for joining.
Thanks so much, Joe. Yeah, that Pieometry book is just absolutely like gorgeous. It's crazy avant-garde art pies. Everyone's been eyeballing it. Next is my great good friend and coworker, Rachel. Please take us away with your books.
Okay. So I am going to start off with a unconventional memoir told in essay, voicemail transcript, and email form. It's called Nobody Will Tell You This But Me. It's by Bess Kalb. She is, in her non-writing life, a staff writer for Jimmy Kimmel. So there's a lot of humor interspersed throughout this. But it's really a very lovely memoir of relations between grandmothers, mothers, and daughters. So it's actually 4 generations of the maternal line of her family, really centered around this incredibly loving relationship between Bess and her grandmother, Bobby. And then talking about both of their mothers also. There's a lot of dysfunction. There's a lot of intergenerational Jewish trauma in this family, but there's also a tremendous amount of love and immense humor. Even though Bess Kalb herself is a humor writer and a very funny writer, some of the funniest bits are her transcripts of her conversations with her grandmother, transcripts of her grandmother's voicemails, the emails that they sent back and forth. I laughed out loud multiple times while I was reading this, but I also came away just with a deep sense of that value of the love intergenerationally within families and how important that is. So it's a great gift book for mothers and daughters in your life. It's also something that you might really enjoy yourself. I read it in one day and was very, very glad that I did. So Nobody Will Tell You This But Me by Bess Kalb. Because of course, nobody will tell you this but your grandmother. Next up is a children's book that is something that I also really recommend for adults or children. It's by the wonderful legend of the art and picture book world, David Macaulay. The book is called Crossing on Time. You might know David Macaulay from his incredible book, How Things Work, which is an encyclopedia with gorgeous art of how all sorts of everyday things in the world work. If children in your life don't have that, they should. It's incredible. This takes some of that technology and combines it with memoir. So it tells the story of David Macaulay as a young man coming to America from England on a steamship. And then it intersperses his personal story with the art and science of how the specific boat he traveled on was made, how that boat works, what the science is of how ships work and big ships work. So there's a tremendous amount of information and a tremendous amount of really gorgeous art. And then these interwoven storylines of the technology, the story of the ship, and the story of young David and his immigration story, his coming to America story. So it's really actually an incredibly moving book that can be read on multiple levels, that works as a picture book for older kids. I would not give this to a toddler or a preschooler. It's definitely an older child than that who needs this, but also is really a very moving book for adults. So that's Crossing on Time by David Macaulay. And then next up, I know that for a lot of us, this is not the year for dystopian fiction, and I understand that, but I actually read this year and I adored it. It is called Deal with the Devil. It is by Kit Rocha, and the subtitle is A Mercenary Librarian's Novel. So if you need a novel of a group of mercenary librarians out there trying to save the world from evil corporations in post-apocalyptic Georgia, which really, who doesn't? This is the book for you. It's a tremendous amount of fun. It's dystopia, but it's not, you know, the world is really messed up in this, but it's not grim and depressing. You come away from this book actually with a lot of joy, because these are book lovers who are setting out to save the world. And so even though it's a grim world that they're dealing with, I came away from this book with a lot of hope and really enjoyed it. It's another one that I just tore through. So if you're looking for a satisfying, quick read, Deal with the Devil by Kit Rocha, dystopian fiction with librarians is what we all need. And then my last recommendation for the evening is one that I have not finished yet. I'm partway through, but I'm actually reading it on David's recommendation. And because we did an event with the author this summer, it is weird. This is Enter the Aardvark by Jessica Anthony. It is a strange, strange literary fiction book, which I am enjoying immensely. It is two interwoven stories with two separate timelines. One is a taxidermist in Victorian England who is taxidermying an aardvark, because why not? And the other storyline is a Republican member of the House of Representatives in present-day Washington, D.C., who is extremely conservative, extremely publicly homophobic, and closeted and gay. And early in the book, this is not a spoiler, he receives a FedEx package with a taxidermied aardvark, which has come from his lover. And suddenly the entire house of cards that he has built for himself starts to unravel due to the fact that the aardvark has. I'm really enjoying this a lot. So if you have any interest in weird literary fiction that is also funny and very page-turnery, I strongly recommend Enter the Aardvark by Jessica Anthony. And there's a comment in the chat saying weird is an understatement for this book, and yes, it is really weird. But if you're prepared to roll with it, it's a lot of fun. So that is it, I think, for our official recommendations, which means we have time for questions from any of you. If you have specific categories, you can play a little bit of Stump the Book. You know, if you want history for your uncle, or you're looking for mysteries, or whatever you're looking for, type it in the chat, or your own recommendations, and Davith and Joe and I will try to come up with ideas. There are a couple of more people chiming in saying that they loved Enter the Aardvark. So yes, it is well worth the weird, I promise. An interesting side note while we're waiting for questions about Kit Rocha, the writing duo who wrote Deal with the Devil, this dystopian book that I wrote. There's been a lot of press recently about a group of romance authors who have gotten together to raise money for Stacey Abrams' group Fair Fight in Georgia. And the two authors who make up Kit Rocha were apparently a big part of that push, which is kind of cool. And they joked that it was, you know, they wrote dystopia about librarians coming to save Georgia, so why not romance authors?
There are a number of questions here in the chat about recommendations for recent mysteries. Kim says, any mysteries? Mary Martin asks specifically for cozy mysteries, and Claire North says, mysteries, maybe the latest Scandinavian. What do we suggest?
I'm pretty sure that Joe Nesbo has a new book out. Forgetting the title. I'm gonna look it up right now.
There is an Albany author. Oops, sorry. For cozy mysteries, there's an Albany-based author who writes really great, like Italian restaurant cozy mysteries. I believe the most recent of which is called "It Can Only Be Murder." I'm going to look those up for you because I'm blanking on her name.
Yeah, the most recent Joe Nesbo is called The Kingdom.
I'm putting the link for it in here, and iPad also came in with that correct answer.
Okay, so the author of the cozy mysteries that I'm thinking of is Catherine Bruns. I've only read the first in the series, and I've not been on a mystery kick this year because it's been this year. But the first one in the series I enjoyed. And it is called "It Can Only Be Murder." And I'm just looking to see for the first one in the series, which I'll also pop in the chat. Also for mysteries, Mike Hare, who is one of our wonderful booksellers in Saratoga, has been speaking very, very highly of the new Carl Hiaasen and saying that that's quite fantastic. Oh, I see a question for romance recommendations, and for that, I am your gal. Let me just put the Catherine Bruns in the chat. So there's a great book for people who like historical romance. Courtney Milan has an amazing book called The Duke Who Didn't, which has been on a lot of best of the year lists. It's set in a small British town in the Victorian era where the community is very incredibly diverse. It's sort of like a few immigrants came to this town and then more came there because they knew it was a safe place to be. And it's all owned by a duke who has been basically an absentee landlord for forever. But actually, unbeknownst to the town, he's been showing up because he himself is half Chinese and very uncomfortable in the British nobility. So he's like going to this town because it's his happy place. And it's a very sweet, lovely love story, very joyous. And so that's my favorite recent romance read. And if whoever was asking for romance suggestions wants something more contemporary, I can come back with that. Just pop in the chat what subgenre you'd like.
I got another one for mysteries. One of my coworkers, actually two of my coworkers, recently read Snow by John Banville and loved it. I've got a copy waiting for me on my bedstand. And I just wanted to read a little chunk of Alden's review because he always writes great reviews. And I don't think he's been on to do one of these things. The last thing the Colonel needs is a murdered priest in the library, something that is especially frowned upon in Ireland. So if that intrigues you at all, I would give Snow a chance. He said that it's a lot more literary than your average mystery. So it's got a bit of that as well in it. I've heard good things from multiple people.
Nancy Luther chimed in the chat. I've heard other people say this as well, that she really enjoyed the Sarah Stewart Taylor's mystery, The Mountains Wild, which we have recommended and who has been on and done virtual events with us as well. And I'll put a link to that.
And Lauren asked for a link to the David Macaulay How Things Work, which I will pull that up. It's really cool. It's like an encyclopedia of how different things work. So there's a question about an Instant Pot cookbook, and I really like Melissa Clark's Dinner in an Instant, which perhaps David can pull up while I'm typing in the link for the way things work. Melissa Clark is one of the cookbook writers for the New York Times. Or not one of the cooking section writers. She does a lot of the recipes in the New York Times. And I thought that it was a very thoughtful, good compilation of recipes. And then the other one I use for the Instant Pot, there's an America's Test Kitchen slow cooker cookbook that also has its slow cookers and pressure cookers, which is great. And then there was a question.
What was the first Instant Pot you mentioned? Sorry.
Dinner in an Instant by Melissa Clark.
Okay.
So for the World War II book that just came by, Eric Larson's The Splendid and the Vile is really remarkable. It does not have maps, but it is available in large print. So that would be a great one. And then historical fiction, there was just a recommendation from Carol. She said Arctic Fury by Greer McAllister, just published. Historical fiction, dual timelines, 1853 and a year later in 1854. Virginia Reeve is hired by a wealthy Bostonian woman to find her husband lost in an expedition. Ms. Reeve chooses 13 women to go with her to find the lost party. On their return, she's arrested and brought to trial for the murder of her team. And I'm trying to think of other, because I do usually read a fair amount of historical fiction. One that I really love is, let's see if I can find it. Another one actually by a local author who's been a great friend to the store, Bachelor Girl by Kim Van Alkemade. It is the story of a young woman who, it sort of follows her life backwards. It starts with her unexpectedly inheriting the fortune of an older gentleman who owns the New York Yankees. And this being a huge news story. And then it sort of follows her life so that you slowly find out why. It's really delightful. It's really well done. And it starts, I think, 19-teens New York, and then goes up through, I want to say, the 40s or 50s.
iPad suggested Jess Walters' The Cold Millions, which is, I know, another book that Alden, our bookseller in Manchester, really liked as well. He wrote a really strong review of that one.
Oh, and Carol recommended a book that I have been eyeing. I keep picking it up and being like, I really need to read this. It's Sarah Smarsh's She Come By It Natural, Dolly Parton and the Women Who Lived Her Songs. And I've been hearing really great things about that, and it looks incredible. So thank you, Carol. Yes, that one has been pretty high on my list for a while. Another good option for the World War II books is anything by Ben Macintyre. He writes a lot of really great spy nonfiction, and several of them are set during World War II. The most recent one is Agent Sonia, Moscow's most daring wartime spy. So she was a spy for Moscow during World War II and then beyond. And then he has others that are more sort of missions specifically during World War II. And they're all really page turners, great, great books.
Claire asked, she said she remembered that I had recommended the new Library of America African-American poetry anthology, 250 Years of Song. I can't remember the exact title of it now. It's a wonderful book, but I haven't read any other poetry really recently, so I'm afraid I don't. Joe, do you know of any recent poetry volumes that you can recommend?
Not in the last couple of months, but within the last year, I definitely have. I'm looking up the title now. Yeah, so there's a book called Cape Verdean Blues by Shauna Barbosa. I really, really loved that book. It evokes the sea. I believe the author herself went to Bennington College, but it has a lot to do with sort of island life, and this I don't, for lack of a better term, I suppose, like the poet or the narrator, her own relationships and her discovering herself. And it's got a lot of interesting turns of phrase. I thought it was a gorgeous book. And I usually, nowadays, it takes a lot for a book of poetry to really grab me. The last one before that grabbed me was called The Mobius Strip Club of Grief by Bianca Stone. And that one is such a weird little book of poetry. The first half of it is, it imagines this sort of purgatory for the author or for the poet, set in a strip club, and it's very strange and totally out of left field. I believe it was inspired by her own grandmother's poem called The Mobius Strip of Grief, the sort of never-ending quality of it. And a lot of the book also has to do with her mother, so I think that she might have been working through something there as well, and sort of comparing her mother to a bird a lot. It was a gorgeous book. I really, really appreciated it. I always want to give a shout out to my favorite poet, Albert Goldbarth, who is very underrated. His book called The Kitchen Sink, it's a collection that spans a lot of his career. And all of his poems are very complex, but relatable. He has this sort of Whitman-esque quality where he zooms in and then pulls back out, but he still connects it to, you know, he connects things like the cosmos or ancient history to a relationship going wrong or a marriage in trouble. Really, really great poetry, and not a lot of people that I've talked to know about Albert Goldbarth.
And I wanted to chime in about, sorry, go ahead, David.
Well, I did read another book of poetry actually within the last month, and I completely spaced it. I'm typing it in here. So New Directions is putting out a series of books collecting the poetry of Fernando Pessoa, who was sort of Portugal's greatest poet ever. In fact, there's a blurb on the back of the cover that said, the greatest 4 Portuguese poets were all Fernando Pessoa, writing in different names. And they had released the Book of Disquiet, his novel, but now it comes the complete works of the poet Alberto Caeiro. And so Pessoa was a modern poet just as great as Rilke or Yeats or Eliot or any of those people, and he's just becoming famous or just getting the reputation he deserves, I think, in this country. And the work of this poet, he invented this, what he called a heteronym, and all of, as I said, Pessoa, Alberto Caeiro was the major with 3 of the other ones, but this is the first in this new series. And Caeiro was a shepherd poet, like off in the fields with his sheep, and sort of unmediated expressions of poetry and joy in the natural world. And then he dies young of, I believe, the flu. And he writes this poem, the book called The Keeper of Sheep, and another volume called The Shepherd in Love, and then some other poems. And then his students, there's also these other creations of Pessoa, begin writing poetry, and this volume contains their sort of prose work about Caeiro's poetry that Pessoa, also wrote, on great reviews that Pessoa wrote in another heteronym about this poet that he was. And it's really remarkable. It's a great new series coming out. And it's got a cover by that guy I mentioned earlier, Peter Mendelssohn.
And then I have one more poetry recommendation. And while I'm doing that, I want to point David and Joe to a question a ways back asking for gift ideas for book lovers, so non-book thoughts. So if you could both think about that while I plug one more poetry collection, which is Seeing the Body by Rachel Eliza Griffiths. She's a poet we were fortunate enough to host here a little while back, and truly one of the most remarkable virtual events that we've had, and we've had some pretty amazing ones. She's a really remarkable poet, and it's a collection that really is about the loss of her mother. So really a beautiful collection. She's also a photographer, and it intersperses her photographs with her poetry. And then there's a recommendation here for Poetry High, Libby, the Washington Post Book World, Love Poems for the Office. So that's another one to take a look at. And then Joe and David, if you have ideas of gifts for book lovers.
As in non-books?
Yes, non-book. I actually have one suggestion, which is not something you can get from Northshire. But if there's a romance reader in your life, the Ripped Bodice bookstore in Los Angeles, which is a romance-only independent bookstore, sells something called trope teas. So it's different tea blends inspired by the tropes that are common in romance novels. So like there's only one bed, or best friend sister, or whatever. And it's all these different tea blends that you can order from them that are inspired by romance novels. So that I'll put the link to the Ripped Bodice's website in here because they are a very cool store.
Yeah. I saw a comment that popped up quickly earlier that mentioned like a subscription for a book lover. And we do offer our Selects program here at Northshire. So that's always a great idea. We love picking out the Selects. It's a lot of fun. You get to sort of choose what the person is going to read next based on their interests. It's a lot of fun to pick those out. I'll point out my mug, which I bought here, which is for book lovers, absolutely. It's a bunch of classic books. We sell great tote bags here at Northshire as well. And what's a book lover without a good tote bag? David, any ideas?
I was going to suggest some things. There's a great company called Out of Print that makes socks and face masks now in our pandemic-y present with sort of book themes. So Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, face mask, and Harry Potter type socks, and they have shirts, and Northshire carries a lot of these things. I was trying to pull up a link, and if you type in what I did, I typed in Out of Print on Northshire, and then it started pulling them all up. The Hungry Caterpillar socks, banned book masks, all kinds of charming gifts.
I also love the lithographs line, which is shirts and posters with like the whole text of a book laid out on them, but in a way that shows an image that's sort of representative of that book. I'm going to see if I can pull up any on our website. Clara North asks if the bookstore carries Bookmarks magazine, which Joe, you might be the one who would know that or could look it up more easily.
Yeah.
And then she also suggests Book Darts.
It was called Bookmarks magazine, is that what you said?
Yeah, Bookmarks magazine.
Yeah, let me find out.
Also, we tend to have a pretty good selection of bookish puzzles. There was a great one that we had a little while ago. I'm going to check to see if we have it. That is all sort of book spines, actually just like Joe's mug. So that's a very cool puzzle for a book lover if people are still needing jigsaw puzzles.
To answer Claire's question, I believe that Saratoga does have a magazine called Bookmarks, but Manchester is currently out of it. The magazines are sent to us sort of, now I don't want to say at random, but we don't get as much of a choice in what is sent to us. So we don't have any currently at Manchester, but it looks like Saratoga has a few in stock. I can't guarantee, but by the time you go visit them, they would have them because of the popularity of this thing here. But, yeah.
And I'm just looking for that puzzle. And that seems to have covered all the questions that we had as people were going, unless there are others. Oh, and there's another recommendation for Mystery Scene magazine. And I'm not seeing the puzzle that I was thinking of, but if I find it later on, I will add it to the blog post tomorrow. But we do tend to have some sort of book themed jigsaw puzzles. So if people are looking for those, those are often an option. We are just,
I was just going to say, for not a strictly book related object, but still a non-book related gift thing, is a new card game called Show Me the Monet, which I'm putting here, in which our Penguin Random House rep, Michael Kindness, recommended this. And it's a fun card game where you can, you've got various artworks in your hand, you're trying to get rid of the forgeries, and you're trying to ascertain, who has the most valuable, art collection in your hand. And that's Show Me the Monet.
And the puzzle that I found, I was actually able to find it, and we do still have it in stock. I'm going to put a link in here. It's a really cool image of a whole bunch of book spines. So there is the puzzle that I was thinking of, which is a great one for book lovers. hard enough, but not too hard because it has writing on it. I did a viciously hard puzzle with a photograph of a Greek island at sunset earlier in the pandemic, and it took me a very, very long time. I do think we are just about out of time. Thank you so much, Joe. And Joe, please pass our thanks on to Kathy. And David and everyone in the audience, thank you for being here. This has been a lot of fun, as it always is. There's a question from Fern asking how she gets to the blog, and we will pop that link right in the chat. But if you ever are looking for it, if you go to northshire.com, then there is a little link in the center. There we go. Perfect. David just added it there. But there's also a link that will say Notes from the Shire at the homepage of northshire.com. And if you click on that, it will bring you to the blog. It has the recommendations we planned on there already. And then at some point tomorrow, we will be adding in all of the extras that we talked about towards the end of the evening. So that later on. Thank you so much, everyone. It was a pleasure to see you all. We'll be back on Monday with rep picks. So our publishing sales reps will be back to do exactly this, but from their perspective. And then Jane Smiley and James Patterson are both coming and doing virtual events. Those are going to be a lot of fun. Hopefully we'll see you again real soon. Have a great night, everyone.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.